Grazie mille, Gianluigi, grazie all'Associazione di Epidemiologia, specialmente a Dr. Roberta Pirastu e al Presidente Fabrizio. Allow me to continue in English. It will be less tortuous for you. I want to thank you for this opportunity to speak to you about what is happening in the world at large, particularly in relation to nutrition in what is called the post-2015 Sustainable Development Framework. I have many slides, but I will run through them very quickly to give you some idea of what is happening and what has been debated in the world. It is useful for us to talk about, first to consider what are called the Millennium Development Goals. And generally speaking, I think many people recognize that while it had some achievements, it also had many weaknesses, particularly the sense of lack of government involvement, because this was largely proposed by some technocrats without the agreement and the involvement of many governments. And this was a major problem. And so despite some important achievements, I think it is important to recognize that there have been important issues which were unfortunately neglected, and progress has been quite uneven. I'll be very happy for you to take copies of this presentation. I'll be happy if the association distributes it so that you can refer to it, because the slides are going to be many and I'm going to run through them quite quickly. But you will also find that there are many gaps, many failures as well in the record of the Millennium Development Goal period, particularly from around 2001 until this year, 2015. And many of these have many significant implications for you as professional epidemiologists. It is important, this is important to understand the transition to what are called the Sustainable Development Goals, which have finally been announced last month in New York, after a process of negotiation which actually followed from the Rio +20 conference, the Sustainable Development Conference in Rio de Janeiro in 2012. And especially the emphasis on sustainability understood very broadly, not only in terms of environment or ecology, but also in terms of what are called economic and social dimensions. So this Agenda 2030, as it is now being referred to, includes 17 Sustainable Development Goals and 169 targets. And much of this has been, all of this has been intergovernmentally negotiated. It is not a neat document, it's not the most beautiful of documents, but most importantly, governments feel a sense of ownership. These are the 17 Sustainable Development Goals for your reference, and the goals themselves, of course, while referring to these issues, actually are elaborated much more. And you will see, of course, that health figures very, very prominently as Sustainable Development Goal 3 after poverty and hunger. But related to hunger is the question of nutrition. Malnutrition, broadly speaking, both undernutrition in terms of lack of dietary energy, as well as micronutrient deficiencies, as well as non-communicable diseases which are related to diet. So I'll come back to that later. So this process, as I emphasized earlier, involved government negotiations, and there are many features which are quite different from the Millennium Development Goals, although many people like to see it as essentially the continuation of the MDG process. Now, this 17 goals can be elaborated, but let me draw to your attention the 9 main targets of which are associated with the health SDG. And this involves, again, many important issues. But I want to just dwell for a moment on the fact that the progress as far as reducing maternal mortality is concerned has unfortunately not been realized. The original target, MDG target, was to reduce maternal mortality by 75%. And only the actual reduction was far less than that, less than even half. Now, but the health SDG deals with a range of issues, including issues such as traffic accidents. But a very important dimension is the commitment, the renewed commitment to universal health coverage. Why do I emphasize this? Because, as you know, in recent decades, there has been a reduction in the commitment to universal health coverage, and this has been very unfortunate. So, without going into the specifics, I think it is important to recognize that besides the 9 targets I mentioned earlier, that there are a number of issues which have been highlighted. For example, a commitment to work to reduce the continued growth of smoking in many parts of the world. And also a very important commitment to try to improve financing for health, financing not only for curative services, but also for preventive services. And of course, related to climate change, there are a number of issues. Now, unfortunately, there was a conference in July in Addis Ababa, which was supposed to talk about financing for development, including other issues involved in means of implementation. One issue, which I'm sure all of you are very aware of, is the rising and arbitrarily rising costs of pharmaceutical drugs. And this has been highlighted by the recent purchase of the rights to produce the hepatitis C drug by a man who has raised the price of that drug by 3,000%. Okay? It is within his power to do so under existing laws, at least the laws which apply in the US and which are enforced internationally through what is called the trade-related intellectual property rights. So this, of course, raises very, very important issues which I'm sure would concern you. And unfortunately, there is no reversal of the trend to strengthening intellectual property rights. And in fact, if you look at the recent trend with what are called the TPPA, which is the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, and for Europe and the US, something called the TTIP. These have very, very important implications. One of my former colleagues, Jeronim Capaldo, has written a very strong and persuasive paper showing that contrary to the claims of the proponents of the TTIP, employment will not increase. Employment will actually go down for a number of reasons which I won't go into right now. But there will be a strengthening of intellectual property rights. And very, very importantly, there are going to be provisions which are currently applied mainly to the US and a number of the US partners, but which are going to be applied also to Europe. The most important is what is called investor-state dispute settlement arrangements, which allows a company to sue a country, okay? A company to sue a country for the loss of planned profits, projected profits. So let me give you an example. Uruguay has been sued because Uruguay has introduced very strict restrictions on smoking. And this, according to the company which is suing Uruguay, is violating an investor agreement and will deprive the company of its expected profits when it first invested in Uruguay. This is also happening in Australia. And even the advertising, which, in Australian law, a cigarette pack has to have a photograph of the consequences of smoking for for the lungs and as well as other types of smoking, which are very, very powerful disincentives to smoke. And these are going to be disallowed if the petition of this company succeeds. So these are very, very unprecedented. You are seeing the strengthening of private corporate rights, which is very unprecedented in the world, and this is something which I'm sure you as public health professionals are very concerned about. Now, very importantly, as I was saying earlier, we have seen while there is a strong commitment to doing a number of very good things, there is no commitment to making more resources available. There is no commitment to increasing ODA. In fact, ODA, or Overseas Development Assistance, has been going down. It went down, especially after the end of the Cold War during the 1990s. It went up slightly after the 9/11 episode and has gone down again in the last 6 or 7 years, relatively speaking, and sometimes even absolutely speaking. So, what are countries left with? For many poor countries, the most important thing is to be able to tax more effectively. And they have been refused the right to negotiate with other countries through the UN system in order to be able to tax their own populations much more effectively. The OECD, the Organization of the Rich Countries, has a tax forum for OECD members, but this tax forum will not be available to other countries in the world. So you can see how all this is, while we have very, very laudable, desirable goals and targets, the ability of many countries to reach these is very severely compromised and limited by existing and new legislation which is taking place not only at the national level, but also, very importantly, at the international level. Now, there's a lot of discussion going on right now until March next year over the question of monitoring of the Sustainable Development Goals. I want to now focus a little bit on the SDGs related to nutrition. While SDG 2 specifically talks about malnutrition, it is important to realize that to do effective work on nutrition, it is important to refer to some of the other SDGs which are relevant to improving human nutrition. And for example, just something which is, I'm sure, obvious to all of you, if you do not have improvements in human sanitation and hygiene, the young children especially are very likely to be vulnerable to gastrointestinal conditions, and they are whatever they consume will not be effectively absorbed and utilized by the human body. And so it passes through the system. So even though you may be feeding those children good food, diverse diets, etc., they are not going to be to benefit because of this. So it is important to have a multi-sectoral approach to to nutrition. It is not simply a question of whether you have the correct supplements or not, or whether you have diverse diets. You also need to address a number of other related issues. So I will not go into detail because these are great. There are too many details to go into right now, but I just want to emphasize something which you all probably already know very well, and that is there are 3 dimensions of nutrition which are basically being addressed. One is the problem of dietary energy, inadequate dietary energy among people who remain hungry, and there are estimated to be almost 800 million people in the world who are chronically hungry, who do not have enough calories on a daily basis, okay? There are many more people who may be seasonally hungry. For example, they may be hungry just before the harvest, or they may be hungry for other episodic reasons. Maybe at a certain period in the year they are not employed and they do not have any income, they're not able to buy enough food, and so on and so forth. But just focusing on those who are chronically hungry, there are estimated to be about 800 million. But the number of people who suffer from micronutrient deficiencies now exceeds 2 billion in a world population of 7.3 billion. So that is a lot of people That is a lot of people. We are talking about essentially, well over 30%, about 30% of the world population. Now, if you consider further that there are now estimated to be somewhere in the region of about 2.1 billion people, okay, who are overweight, and 1/3 of them are obese, okay? So you can see that this proportion has gone up very, very significantly. The last time the WHO did such an estimation, the estimate was 1.4 billion. And this was only about 7 years ago. So between 1.4, it went up to 1.9, and now it's estimated to be about 2.1. All this happened within a 5-year time frame. So you can see that probably overweightness and related to that obesity is growing very, very rapidly. And there is very little, and there seem to be very few checks to this. Now, this is not a rich country problem. This is a very serious problem in middle-income countries. Now, for example, the incidence of obese people is higher in Mexico than in the US. Okay? And in Central America, for various reasons, there is a very high incidence of overweightness, partly because of the way BMIs, body mass indices are calculated and so on. So I think we need to have an approach and to recognize in my organization, the Food and Agriculture Organization, we recognize that food systems are a central part of the problem, but they are also a fundamental aspect of the solution. Food systems are responsible for the fact that many people are hungry. Food systems are responsible for the fact that many people suffer from hidden hunger, micronutrient deficiencies, and they are also responsible for the fact that particularly with the greater use of convenience foods, we are seeing an epidemic in terms of diet-related non-communicable diseases. Now, these are just some numbers to give you a sense of how the profile of hunger is changing in the world. You can see the two pie charts. The pie chart has diminished, but not by very much. And you can see that the African share has gone up a lot, and South Asian share remains high, and so on and so forth. But remember that malnutrition is still very widespread, especially among young children, because that is the time when you can actually have an estimate of who is undernourished by looking at the usual measures of body length and so on, and weight and so on. So wasting remains a problem, fortunately not as serious as it used to be. Stunting is certainly very, very much with us today, and underweight children is a serious problem. But undernutrition is declining, undernutrition particularly in the sense of body weight and so on, but not fast enough. These are, okay. Now, the community of nutritionists are now suggesting to have 8 indicators of nutrition. Okay, now I'm switching to hidden hunger. I'm just going to run through these slides because otherwise I will never get to the end of this presentation in time. But it is to give you a sense of the widespread problems involved and the number of people who are affected. Okay, these are deficiencies which are very easily treated. You are familiar with what needs to be done, so I don't need to comment too much on this. But I think one has to recognize that particularly nutrition, that the basic problems involved will require women particularly to take a very strong leadership role. You think of women not only as very fundamental in terms of influencing household food consumption, but also particularly you find that many farmers, especially the small farmers, so-called family farmers, it is often the women who are most involved because many of the men have moved out. And so both at the production level as well as at the consumption level, we need to take action. Now, before this epidemic growth of overweight and obesity in the recent past took place, when we did our estimates of how much the toll of the health costs of malnutrition are, we estimated it is now equivalent to about 1/20 or 5% of world income. Okay? That is the toll. Most of it is really due to overweight and obesity. But of course, undernutrition also has a very heavy toll. And the reason why undernutrition doesn't seem to figure so much, economically speaking, is because most of the undernourished, especially the hungry, are very poor. So the economic costs involved are actually very small because they are not seen to be economically very important. Okay? Just to give you a sense of how serious the problem of obesity is, or non-communicable diseases, if you think about the comparative economic burdens of different problems we have in the world, number one problem relates to armed conflicts. The economic cost burden of that is 2.1 trillion. Smoking, again, 2.1 trillion, number two. Number three is obesity, estimated at 2 trillion. So we are talking about huge numbers, okay? Of course, these are for the entire globe, but the numbers are staggering when you think about them, okay? Now, many people think that, certain problems are problems of rich countries, certain problems are problems of poor countries or developing countries. In fact, you find that there is a great deal of overlap among these different, so I'll run through this again very quickly to give you a sense of okay. Okay, I think I don't need to tell you why we need to improve nutrition, so I'll skip over this. I'll skip over the need to reform the food system. Romans and other Italians are very, very conscious. You all know very much about the so-called Mediterranean diet. I want to remind you of a presentation I watched 2 days ago, and that presentation actually suggested that the Mediterranean diet may be a nice legend from the past, because the evidence seems to be growing in Italy that more and more people are shifting to convenience foods with very significant health implications. And so that very famous sculpture of David, I'm sure you've all seen this fat David, which is now going around in the Photoshopped version of David. Now, I would like to conclude by raising an issue which many countries are facing. I suspect your own country faces this issue as well, and that is, how do we handle public-private partnerships? This is a very, very major challenge as we go forward, and particularly in the health area. There's a lot of pressure. The World Health Organization has taken a very strict rule in the past of not involving what are called non-state actors in public policy making, but that rule is now being challenged, especially by Europe and North America, and it is likely to be changed. I think if that happens, you will need to think very seriously about what are the alternative guidelines you put in place to ensure that the public interests and public needs are not compromised in the interests of private greed. So I'll leave you with that thought, and I hope we will have an opportunity to reflect on where we are in the world today and how we can go forward together. Thank you very much for your attention.